Told were the very thing that, you were told was the unlovable part of you can be the thing that is, that sets you free in the end, that is the most, powerful part of who you are. So I think it varies from project to project and from whatever theme I'm taking on and what role I want it to play or how closely I want to examine it. But it's definitely it's just there and it will always be there in some facet of it, because there's a non-binary character in the new book. So it's just, yeah, it's always going to be there. And I'm always going to be sort of looking at it and thinking about it, especially in terms of whatever genre or trope or time period or whatever I'm looking at.
Yeah. Excellent answer on that. There is something about just ever presence that I think is interesting, and just always grappling in some sense with questions of safety and like, what does it mean that a lot of our narratives of queerness are about leaving home? And I know there's a lot of fun academic work like Another Country and all that dealing with, well, what about queerness in rural areas? What about the queer South? But, as someone who's also from here and has experienced that as predominantly a trauma, like it's a messy feeling to love your home and also to know the ways in which it can't or doesn't love you. And like how you work with that in a very complex space, I think is excellent. That was also, so there's like a weirdly intensely hopeful bent to Summer Sons, which I think a lot of folks, when they hear the beginning of it, are like, that sounds like it's going to be a rough emotional journey. And it is, but I think part of what I wanted to look at was he is coming home, and it is in coming home that he's able to meet a whole little family of gay people, more or less, of varying stripes, and to see that his own like internal sense of untouchable sexuality, that like he cannot approach his own queerness in any way, doesn't start to dissolve until he comes back south and meets Sam and Riley and their entire group of just car racing messy creatures. And there are women in that space also. And I think part of what I wanted to deal with gender wise pretty complexly, I hope, in there is the ways in which queer men are accountable for how they treat the women in their lives in these moments of self-realization, because Andrew is actively terrible to most of the women that he interacts with. And there are moments in the text where he is held accountable for that pretty explicitly, because I found that both a real thing, but also something that I couldn't really let stand in the narrative without having some sort of commentary on it being a book about men and men's relationships in a lot of ways that didn't sort of discount the presence and importance of women in their lives and as people who deserve to yell at them when they do stupid, awful things. So that was part of gender in the book. And also looking at the fact that very masculine presenting men who appear to be like rednecks or et cetera in that way to the reader can also be very caring and very soft and very careful with their friends and their family, and they can be very invested in their communities, and they can be gay or queer or whatever words they might not use or use. And I think that's something that I've really enjoyed seeing people's responses to since the book came out, is the like powerful response to being like, Sam is extremely hot. I would have sex with Sam. And I have had an amazing number of tweets and comments from people who are like, I've never seen a man who looks like this be queer in a book like this. And I think that was something I wanted to do very much with the, well, maybe you can come home and find yourself there and find a handsome man while you're at it who can be good. And maybe men can be good to one another, even here. So yeah, doing all that. And the next one will be about gender, because so many nurses went away to World War I and came back thinking of their gender and sexuality quite differently when they returned home from the war. And that's fun. And it will be a trans book in many ways, but in that messy, fun 1910s sort of way. So yeah, I like to play there.
Yeah, I love what you said about like creating that story that shows that like you can be queer in this space and find community in this space and find safety in this space. Because I do think so many of the stories. I mean, like even growing up, I did not think it would be possible to be happy at home. Like it just didn't seem like it was even an option. And yet like there are so many people, queer people who are coming, who've left often and who are coming back and they're like, I'm going to make that place. I'm going to create that space. I'm going to make it possible. And I found incredible queer community since I moved back. Like it's here and it's just as vibrant and complex and amazing as it is anywhere else with, you know, its own particularities. And I think that's really important to hold all of that nuance.
Yeah. And like you can enjoy a city and enjoy your home, and both are okay, but they mean different things in different ways. Yeah. Yeah. The leaving and coming back, I think, gives you a particular feeling about it, I think, or at least for me, it has very much so. Like, it's still complicated. There's a lot of conflict in there, but you miss it when you're not here.
Yeah, it's like you said, and I think the first answer, me, like, you know, I had to go away to get a little bit closer to, you know, set it a little bit further away in order to feel more connected. And I felt that way when I moved, you know, it was like I left, but once I left, all these things that I probably would not have noticed as much about home suddenly got thrown into really stark relief because I wasn't there and I didn't have like the shared like cultural element. So I started to notice and think about things that I hadn't considered before. And I think I ended up loving home very differently, but even more because I had sort of left and spent some time away.
Oh, absolutely. Like getting that perspective, I think, is very helpful in processing some of that trauma about your upbringing.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay. I also think, you know, as we're in a deeply charged political moment for women and queer folks and everybody, more or less, and people of color, like the South is the site of most of our great activist movements. So you can't discount it in that way. And I think about that a lot these days. Yeah. That does kind of lead into our next question in a way. This is rolling very smoothly. Good job. That both of our books are dealing with trauma and with memory also in some very particular ways. So how do you deal with writing about traumatic subjects, traumatic experience on a craft level, but also that personal level?
Yeah. We'll start with personal. The short answer is therapy. It's just making sure I'm taking care of myself. I think it's really easy. Um, you know, I hear people talk about writing as catharsis, and it is and can be, but also think it's really easy to lean too much into your writing as a tool for that, or as a replacement for other kinds of support that are necessary, especially when you're writing into difficult places in your own life or just difficult material in general. So I try to, you know, lean on other supports and make sure that I have a lot of other things, you know, to kind of turn to, including therapy, including working on my own stuff, trying to make sure that I'm coming to my work from as grounded a place as I possibly can. Yeah, and just having a lot of people around me, getting a lot better at taking care of myself as I work, and, you know, taking what I need and pacing myself. So all of those things, like using all of that amply as much as I can from beginning to end. And then just from a craft level, I think trauma influences a lot of my work. I mean, the speculative elements are often very deeply linked with trauma or traumatic events, and thematically, like things that come out of that. So it shapes the story differently, I think, when I think about it from that traumatic perspective. So like time can get a little wobbly, bodies get a little wobbly, perception gets a little wobbly, and like how to reflect that in the writing itself. So, you know, where I can't follow the narrator, or the narrator has a fog that kind of stays with her, which is definitely this kind of trauma response. It is this sort of, you know, fragment that speaks to her, warns her away from certain things, but it's just this feeling that'll often settle over her. She has moments of dissociation in the text. So it definitely shapes, I think, how I try to bring those things that I've experienced as someone with CPTSD, like into the experience of the book. And often sort of the speculative elements to me get closer to the actual lived experience of trauma than just straight realism does. You know, in Every Bone of Prayer, the protagonist sheds her skin and walks around in her bones, which is a way to explore dissociation. And for me, that all of those descriptions get closer to what it actually feels like to be dissociated, to be disconnected from your body, than anything I could have just written about otherwise. You know, the loss that Marin has and where I can't follow, like the loss of her mother, and also like the complications of addiction, like the doorways get at that in ways that I feel like allow me more room and more depth than I would have in straight realism. So it's also like the speculative elements really come into play with trying to recreate like what feels like an honest representation of how trauma feels and functions in a person's life.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. It also makes me think of Saidiya Hartman's work on how speculative storytelling can work to fill the gaps of trauma in a particular way, and like the gaps in the archive, whether that's sort of your archive of memory, because so often memory is the first thing to go, or like a clear and present memory during an experience of trauma or afterwards. And I think that's something that I find very interesting on a craft level too, of like, well, what can I use this to do? Because I don't lend myself to life writing well, though I love many friends' works who are those things. It makes me feel like I'm being skinned in a negative way. And I don't care for that. It's a little too much. And you can never quite grasp the thing for me in that frame. Whereas having the frame of a haunting or a ghost made very literal feels a lot more like, in an affective sense, what trauma feels like. And I also think about that with like Caitlin Kiernan's work. I just finished revising an article about it, so it's very fresh on the mind of like how writing in these ways of speculative fiction and metaphor and hauntings is the only way sometimes to get at what that really feels like and how you experience loss or trauma in other ways. And I think particularly on a craft level in this book, it was a lot about prose, which is something that a handful of reviewers picked up and that made me super happy, which is that the prose at the beginning is very different in pace of the sentences and word structure than the prose by the end. So you're starting very mired in this wall of grief. Like, it is not a pleasant experience of grief. It is truly like raw suffering, but it's almost numb at the same time. And in writing that, I very much tried to pull the prose back to be very almost like reportage initially, that you're not getting much of Andrew's responses to things until he has flare-ups of rage, because that is the predominant emotion that he can connect to at the beginning of the story. And then as events occur and the haunting gets worse, but as he also starts to make intimate connections and friendships and feel things again, there becomes a heat in the prose again, and he starts noticing other men mostly, and that's where you start to see how things come back to life. And by the end, there's a lot more short sentences and sensory detail in that. And I had a lot of fun trying to play a game with the reader where they might not necessarily notice why the emotions are flowing in the way that they are, but that the prose would hopefully make it happen. And that was sort of how I wanted to play with the craft level of like, not only is there a ghost, but you're also going to just really struggle with this first 100 pages or so. It's not going to feel good. And I think that was enjoyable in a weird way to play with. And on a personal level, I think also therapy, just years and years and years of therapy for post-traumatic stress is the only way to deal with it. I'm pro therapy. But also thinking a lot and through the sort of language of other writers whose work I like a great deal, that also wrangles deeply with traumatic experience and queerness. So particularly there was a Yale craft talk a while back that like Saeed Jones was on and Roxane Gay, and they were talking about the idea of not cannibalizing yourself while you're writing trauma in these important ways, and to have that personal catch to know when you are doing something potentially harmful to yourself in the process of the writing, because therapy is therapy and writing might be catharsis, but you might just be re-traumatizing yourself. So like being able to tell the difference. And also in just the very pull the lens back, book tours and these conversations we're having now is insisting on that, like not answering certain questions or seeing things ahead of time to be prepared. And that's something I think about with particularly like Carmen Maria Machado when In the Dream House came out. The press circuit for that seemed like they managed it very intensely to be like, there's only so much I can talk about this. And I think I tried to approach some of the content of this the same way initially, to be like, I simply am not going to answer some of these questions. And I think knowing that also, like how to take care of yourself on the circuit.
Yeah, boundaries, you get a lot of practice with boundaries during that part. And I think having, agents, editors who are supportive of that and remind you, like, you can say no to things and it's okay to say no. Like, that's all very important. And knowing, like, you don't have to offer more than you can actually give.
Mm-hmm. And hey, we wrote fiction. So sometimes you can just be like, read the
Love
book.
fiction.
Who's to say? Awesome. Ooh, memory. That was the last little bit. Like, I think there's fun stuff about memory in your work sometimes too, and how memory interacts with the story. Like, not even just the bad kind, but the good kind. And
I think it's definitely one of my obsessions, because I think, I don't know, it's fascinating. And I think memory opens up a lot of, or disrupts linearity in a way that is fascinating and that I love, because I love a narrative that does not necessarily adhere to a, forward moving kind of time. Like, time is, in my experience, a lot more circular and bending, and, it sort of twists back and around all the time. And so trying to use memory to reflect that, I think in Every Bone of Prayer, that comes through a lot with the kind of magic system that exists there. It's based on names, but the names are made up of memories, and sort of like this very fragmented, kind of like watercolor approach to memory, and things come in and out of the name. They're very dynamic and fluid. So working with, how our memories, thinking about how memories are stored, like traumatic memories are often either gone or they're like razor sharp detail. It's like you'd remember every single thing about it. And so kind of toying with what that looks like, and what happens when, in that book, there's a memory that kind of comes into her name and goes out after she's been able to talk about it and feel like a kind of processing with it. The memory is no longer as important, so it leaves her name. And so thinking about how memory and trauma work together, and then in Where I Can't Follow, memory is, and I think collective memory too, is really important to me. The idea of like family memory and communal memory. Because at home, like one of the things that feels very Appalachian to me is like, I grew up hearing not just like, oh, that's a place where this person lives, but the whole family that had lived there when the house was built, what happened to it, if it burned down when it was rebuilt, who owned the land. Like, people were contained within place in this very like tangible way. And the whole like shape of the place was also like its history, and who kept it and who remembered who. And I think that's very present in Where I Can't Follow, and especially the gaps. So like the places where what don't we talk about collectively and communally and within our families? And what does that do when we miss out on that? And how do we fill those gaps? And, Marion lost her mother when she was 9, and she feels that loss very keenly throughout the book, but she ends up selling her grandmother's prescription pills to make money. And as she does so, she ends up sort of moving in circles where her mother, who was an alcoholic, moved in. So she ends up meeting and speaking with her mother's friends as she is selling pills. So she gets closer to her mother through this, and sort of gets to see how she is remembered in other places. And how that shifts Marin's perspective and understanding of her. So also that idea of like, yeah, what memories we carry on and which ones we try to bury or suppress. And even within our community, what we talk about and don't talk about, and the ramifications that has.
Yeah, I also am big on historical and communal memory as a thing to work on. I think that comes through predominantly in a lot of the background themes in Summer Sons. For example, who your bad guy is ultimately, in a systemic and historical sense, is making a pretty particular comment about class and racial politics in the South with one of those very old, very wealthy families in Tennessee, and how an attachment to a particularly brutal and vicious history and kind of wealth somehow manages to pretend to cleanness in a very special way. And I think peeling back the skin on that and showing how ugly it is underneath was a lot of what I wanted to think about, because Southern Gothic so often doesn't, which is simply wild to me. Like, if we're going to admit the South is a very haunted place, I think you have to acknowledge why it's such a haunted place. And so many texts didn't do that in a way that I found really unsatisfying, in particularly wanting to talk about whiteness as a structure and a thing in a book, like as a white person from here. I think that's really important to do. And then also communal memory in a very different sense of like how people tell stories about themselves, how you structure your idea of yourself through story and through the relationship stories you tell. So the cousins in particular at various points in the book tell different stories to Andrew about their upbringing. And by taking each of those stories, you can build a sense of their whole family structure almost, and why they have the weird little buttons that they do, and why they respond in certain ways to certain things, even when it's unproductive, or Sam is babying his fully adult young cousin like more than he should be now that they're both in their mid-20s, like those sorts of things. And you see why, because of these stories of like a communal history that Andrew receives once he's part of that kin group, like building kinship in a particular way through sharing almost traumatic memory, but the ones that built you in a sense, and being able to have that intimacy. So I think that's in there. And I've also been reading, I put it on the shelf to be about it, to be like, look at it. But the Let the Record Show, the political history of ACT UP that Sarah Schulman wrote recently. And I am feeling furiously alive and just furious reading it, in the way that queer community memory does and does not survive and is not preserved in terms of our politics of resistance. So that's, I'm thinking about it at the moment. Yeah. Cool. So I think we've got one more big question and then the fun wrap up. We're on time. Look at that. So the fun one, what elements in your book, my book, feel emotionally particularly Appalachian that we haven't discussed yet? And I think this can be small, weird little things.
Yeah. I love that question. I think one of the things that I never feel like I get to talk about enough is like the sense of humor in my work feels incredibly Appalachian, especially like the darkness of it. You know, growing up, so many of the folks that I knew were so incredibly quick-witted and hilarious, but often like hilarious in like the worst moments of your life, like being able to find something to laugh about as it's falling apart, or at least how it's falling apart, right? Some way to kind of pick that up, which is important to me, even though the books deal with like pretty heavy thematic stuff. Like there's always some kind of like tenderness and sweetness around the sense of humor and shared inside jokes and family jokes, and really picking at each other, which feels very Appalachian to me, you know, like, you know, giving each other shit over any tiny little thing, which builds like a kind of bond, but also like a kind of openness that I've not always experienced in other relationships, is like a willingness, I think, and where I can't follow the characters are really good at calling each other on their stuff and being open about when they have a problem with each other. You know, there's not a ton of passive aggression. There's just aggression. So that feels, you know, Appalachian to me. That's something I definitely noticed culturally when I started to move in more like middle class or upper class spaces, is like that kind of frankness and forthrightness and loudness. You know, like there's there's a volume to Appalachian conversations that I hope is reflected in my work. And I think thematically, you know, there's a lot of loving things that are hard to love, which feels very Appalachian, a kind of willingness to to not look away from the rough parts, the bad parts, the dark parts, the hard parts, you know, to take something as a whole, which to me feels very thematically Appalachian. You know, it's like, even in loving the place, you know, like we talked about earlier, it's like, it's not because we don't acknowledge what it is or the hard parts of it, it's that we love it anyway. And I think that's something that comes through in a lot of my work, is this willingness to sort of see people for all of their ugliness and loudness and strangeness, and love them anyway, love the place anyway, and find, you know, to hold both together without flinching.
Yeah. Yeah, loudness is a good one. I feel like that was going into higher education in particular, and even when people are not middle class, there's a performance of middle classness that you are expected to learn, as we all know. Like, and the level of loudness that I feel is appropriate in a conversation, and how you interrupt each other, but that's not interrupting to shut a conversation down. It is to show you are participating and actively listening, and then learning that that is not necessarily how everyone communicates, and that that will be perceived as rude as hell in a lot of places. And I still feel the instinct sometimes in like group gatherings that are not Appalachian or Southern in that way, to be like, no, I'm participating. And in reality, you're just shouting at someone and like having to dial it back a little bit at the time. And it's a lived moment I don't think will ever stop. Like, I think I will be elderly and still having to like scale it back a little bit in the right moment. But I also think that's what's just so queer about Appalachia and a lot of poverty culture in general. Like, many of these things I found an exact and similar home for in the gay community, because being willing to just have a certain enjoyment of bullying each other gently about things that you know are mostly okay to bully each other about, and just to keep us all on the same tier of honesty about who we are as people. Like, that was a learned behavior that I did not learn in queer community later. I brought it with me. It just goes by different names in different places. And I think some of that comes from, you know, places that struggle a lot. Like, you have to be honest with each other, because there's no reason not to be at that tier, even when it is painful, and you can make a joke out of it. And I think any marginalized group really develops their own special sauce version of that that can be very fun in community. My like other one that I always think of with this book was smell. It's really hard to describe scent in a book because it's written. But when I think about being in the woods, for example, like the first thing I think about is how it smells. And there is a full edit run where I went back through and was trying to think about like, okay, what does it smell like to have your car windows down and be like driving on a backwoods road? Like, it smells green, but in what way does it smell green? It smells green differently than weed. Like, it smells green differently than if you didn't turn your air conditioning on in your house because you don't want to pay for it and things have gotten sort of musty. Like, it's a different smell. And when I was away and came back, smell was the first thing I noticed was comforting again. Like, it smelled like home.
Yeah.
Which I miss when I'm in a city, even though I'm usually having a great time. There's not enough trees. And even if there are trees, they're not the right kind of trees. So yeah, I think that's my big one. I
I
like
love
thinking
that.
about smell. All right. So what's next? What are we to wrap up? What's our next projects? You hinted a little. I would love to hear more.
Yeah, so I'm working primarily on the next adult book, which is set during the 1850s in Kentucky. It focuses a lot on the spiritualism movement, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but was a religious movement that was in many ways sort of an answer to other religious movements at the time, sort of pushing away from it. It was also a time when there's just huge scientific discovery and growth, just a huge boom and everything. And the war was looming, and spiritualism was also like a very deeply political movement at the same time. And a lot of its members took some pretty hard stances on slavery and sexism and all kinds of issues at the time. But it was also just it was a religious movement that sort of threw into question the ideas of sort of hierarchy and God, and who is saved and what heaven is and how it functions and who is allowed there, which of course reflects on, you know, everyday culture and those same questions of, you know, belonging and rights. And it's the one where you see people having seances, you know, the pictures of women with ectoplasm, you know, pouring out of their mouth and ears, which I just adore, and which feels very queer to me, in this very embodied, sort of visceral way. So I'm very excited to work with that. It's about a young woman and her family, and she and her little sister are mediums. And so it's them sort of finding that out. Yeah, and sort of going from there. I'm very excited about it. It's been a lot of fun to write. The research part is interesting, finding what to leave out and what to put in and all that, but very excited to be working on it. And also working on a middle grade book on the side and trying to finish some short stories. I like to move between projects. I find it helps with nerves and just to have more things to kind of put my attention to. And also, if I get stuck on one and go work on another, often something will shake loose. And so being flexible, I think, is something that the world has asked of me since I started publishing my books. That's a lesson I've had to learn. So trying to keep busy.
Yes. Similarly, I like to move between project types. So I do officially have a novella coming out from Tor.com in March 2023 now. That's the official date. I finally have it, called Feed Them Silence. And that one is not an Appalachian book. It is set up north in the Michigan, Minnesota area. And it's about neoliberalism and climate grief and conservation being not really conservation, and how we misuse our connections to non-human animals, and a failing lesbian marriage. It's the vibes are rancid, as the kids say online. And I did write it at the beginning of COVID, and I think you can sense that, but I also think it's enjoyable in a very A24 sort of dark way to read. And I think you can only get away with that at the length of a novella. So it's not, you can do one long sitting, and then you're free. So I'm excited to see how that goes as it comes out, because it's very different tonally from Summer Sons. But on a much more similar tonal note, I've recently finished a draft and I'm working on some of the fiddly cleanup aspects of a short story / novelette about a haunted porn theater that, for anyone from Louisville, is loosely based on my time working at Metro Station. But it's also very much about, what does it mean to be boyfriends or to have a relationship if one of you, due to trauma, chooses or cannot participate in sexual intimacy, but is like kind of a horny monster anyway, and one of you is asexual, and like, how do you negotiate that relationship space, while it's also sort of about, once again, class and higher education, because I sure do have a pattern on some of those things. And I think that one I've had a lot of fun with, writing a story that is just the most explicitly sexual thing I've ever written, where no one is going to have sex. And I think that's doing something fun, given all the moral panics about queer sexuality we're in right now. A little bit of spite and a teeny bit in there.
That always helps.
Yeah. Oh, and an academic article forthcoming from Signs about Annalee Newitz's Future of Another Timeline that's coming out in August. Yeah. All right.
All right.
We did it.
All right. Thank you. That was lovely. That was absolutely a seamless, lovely discussion that I really enjoyed. You covered a lot of ground and a lot of themes, and these are clearly exciting works, and I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about them. So with that, I'm going to open the floor. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can either do it in the chat and I will read it aloud, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. And I think I'll unspotlight you guys so that everybody's equal in their boxes. How's that? Let's see. Remove spotlight. All right. And then remove spotlight. Here we go. Oops. Okay. I don't know that did that work? Did I get your spotlight?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So do we have any questions? Take a minute to there's gallery. Take a minute to think about it. I can always start us off. I'm happy to do that. I found a lot of really interesting themes. But Lee, I want to ask you a little bit more about the theme that I find very near and dear, considering where I'm sitting right now, and that is the question of class in academia, right? And I wonder if you would elaborate a little bit more how Vanderbilt plays a role and how you're thinking about sort of these issues. Like, what if you were to sort of put your finger on the on the sort of the problem or question, sort of how would you, how would you frame it? What are you thinking about in terms of the problematics?
So there's a book by Matt Brim called Poor Queer Studies that I think I would echo in a lot of ways. I'm a first generation graduate student from a background of relative poverty from where I'm from. I have spent most of my adult life in what is legally considered poverty, including now. Like, not to put too fine a point on it, because UK is not unique in this, but the graduate student salary to do a highly trained job that is a great deal of work is about $16,000 a year to functionally work full-time teaching students in higher education, which is wrong. I'm like not afraid to say that one, and I think most people would agree. So what that sets up in particular is a system where the only people who can comfortably, easily do quality academic work and have the free time to pursue research and go to conferences are people from middle to upper class backgrounds, often whose parents are in academia. And if you're a poor kid coming in, like, you have none of these tools, just none of them, that all of these other students have financially and emotionally, in being brought up in a family that knows the tricks of the trade, that knows how to do higher education, which has always been a place for the wealthy, particularly in the US and the white in the US. And it's only been very recently that doors have sort of opened to include any kind of minoritized or marginalized group in higher education, but we have not built any structures to support those students. Like, just functionally, we have not. And I think a lived experience of that has made me pretty mad about it, even though I clearly participate in the system and intend to continue on in it. But I think it's important to acknowledge and talk about the trauma and the stress of being a student from poverty or from another kind of marginalized background, entering these spaces, and how you then interact with colleagues and peers whose economic access and whose privilege in that way is just so much vaster than yours. I mean, I've had colleagues who have to hold second or third jobs while they're pursuing their studies, or who do sex work because it is an easier way, in some senses. You can manage your own time more to pay for their bills while they're in higher education. And I think we just don't acknowledge that enough. And it's always on the back of my mind in these things that I'm working on. Whew.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lee. Um, uh, Ashley, I think I'm going to, if I may, turn a question in a very different way. Way. It sounds like you've done a lot of writing for adults, but I'm curious about to what degree is your writing in the middle school grades going to be different, the same, reflecting the same themes, or how are you approaching that sort of very different audience than the one that have traditionally worked with?
Yeah, so I have noticed that it doesn't actually require a huge shift when you're moved from an audience of adults to an audience of like middle grade children, which is about 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Especially like in terms of prose and things like that. Like, not a lot is shifting. I'm still also who I am. So thematically, the material is very familiar. It's a lot about ghosts and the stories that get told within a community about, like, especially in the middle grade I'm working on, about coal mining and it's the purpose that it has served within communities. I grew up in a coal mining town, and there was a lot of basically propaganda about coal that we grew up with, and it was really fostered a kind of dependence on coal. I mean, I grew up in families who, used script and came out of coal mining towns and that kind of thing. And it's like, so the book really deals with like what coal mines have done, and sort of like how you can both love people who have come there and also want more at the same time for your home and for the people that you love, and how you can kind of disentangle the stories that get told, and also like how the stories that get told are also about the people who are in power, and who gets to choose the stories, and which, sorry, feels like an important thing to start talking about with children, and to know that it's important to share your own story. It's important to share your own truth, and it's important to ask questions and those kind of things. So thematically, I feel like my work is me, no matter where I'm writing. It's just trying to take that and also like imbue it. I think middle grade opens up a level of playfulness and imagination that is a little bit different to the work I've done in adult realm. So getting to really lean into that and make it fun and spooky and exciting in a different way that will hopefully appeal to kids. So it's kind of a combination of the things that I have always been with some sort of new tricks.
Thank you. That's great. We have a question from Doug. Doug Slaney.
Yeah, this is great. Lee made me think of this question, but it's a good question for both of you. Southern Gothic is not a genre I know very well. And I'm really curious to know what other books that are close to you in your particular sorts of craft and issues, but also the books out there that we should be reading. And actually the same for you, right? What kind of books do you recommend to people or that are especially close to you? Yeah, I'm really curious to know.
Yeah. So I think with Southern Gothic, you have your big classics. There's Faulkner. Like, I have to say it because that's the big one. There is one little joke about Faulkner hidden in the book. But I do like a lot of the much more updated ways of dealing with the Gothic as a genre. Particularly, I think I had mentioned Carmen Maria Machado's memoir / critical text / haunted house Gothic, the In the Dream House one that I think was sort of exploding what a Gothic does in some ways to do different work. So that one was a big one. And I also enjoy ways of playing with, okay, I'm going to back up slightly. So you get the British Gothic because manor houses, wealth, all of that, class politics is big. When you bring it to the South, we have a very different version of that is a lot more about, even if it never directly discusses it, the politics of slaveholding in the South and the war and all of those things, where we're still looking at class and how those sorts of things work, but there is definitely a deeply racialized component to it that is often absent in like the traditional British Gothic. So that's what I'm building into there on. I also think there's something to be said about Gothic is an energy that's in a lot of queer horror, even if they're not directly doing like a haunted house Gothic, but the sense of wrongness, I think, of being a little out of step and that there's something you're missing a little bit, but you don't know what it is. And that's the haunting, is that sense that something is a little bit left from where it should be, and that you're being stalked or hunted by this thing in a space where you should be safe and comfortable and domestic, like your house or your institution or your relationship, but there's something hidden that's going to come back up and get you, which is part of that. Other books that built this one,
it's really cool that expanding the haunting. I'm really taken with that. I hadn't thought about that. That's really great. Yeah.
Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. That one I read after the first draft of this was done and I was revising, and then was like, oh, you did it emotionally. That's the thing. Okay, how do I do that? So that went into the DNA too.
Great, thank you. Ashley, what do you think?
Yeah. So I think with my work, a lot of the things that I like to encourage people to read is like more modern and recent books about Appalachia, especially like fictionally. So Robert Geip is a writer who I adore and has a trilogy of books that are amazing. Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle, Leah Hampton, oh gosh, Alison Stein does sort of fantastical stuff set in Appalachia, especially her first book. So just reading about the area from people who are sort of currently writing about it and things like that, I think is really important.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you. Don't be shy. We have opportunity to learn about writer's craft and a lot of other things. I actually, well, you're supposed to wait 30 seconds. I don't want to jump in before too early. Go once, come on. Don't be shy.
You can put it in the chat if you're feeling shy about raising your hand on the Zoom.
Yeah, that's fair. I'd be happy to read whatever you put in the chat. So can I ask you about Gothic, right? That both of you actually, I mean, I understand that, that this is a genre kind of, in like, how would you define it? Right? Like, does it have to have ghosts? Does it have to have a manor house? Like what exactly is Gothic in the way that you're, sort of, they're thinking about these things?
So for me, I would say the Gothic, if you want to just think about a vibe, an affect, as it were, is like I started to say, I think at the end before, that things seem on the surface like they are arranged correctly by the social, like, hegemonic order. Like, you have a nice house that you have inherited, you have a seemingly successful marriage, or a favorite of the Gothic is the incestuous sibling relationship, which there is also a bit of a nod to in Summer Sons in a particular way, because I am who I am as a person. And all of those things where you realize as you go through that something's not quite right. And going from that feeling of something is not quite right is the way the Gothic tends to make social commentary. So whether that originally is about mad women, you know, that sort of thing, that the secret.
In the attic.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the secret is usually about a terrible social sin or violence that's been done to someone that we're hiding, and how that erupts back into daily life, usually as a haunting of some kind. I think actually Crimson Peak is an excellent film example because he's doing it on purpose. Like, it is a meta Gothic about the Gothic that is also immensely fun to watch and visually stunning. And that has all of the tropes overplayed to the point of delicious melodrama. So that's my, like, the go-to for, like, do you want to get the vibe? Watch Crimson Peak.
All right, thank you. All
I would
right.
say second Crimson Peak. I feel like it does that really beautifully. And it's just fun. Yeah, I think, yeah, to echo a lot of what you said, like, the Gothic to me feels a lot about, like, taboo and wrongness and strangeness, and, like, really, like, delving into examining it, often using it as a prop when it's not done as well, but, you know, and even disability, like the Gothic will often use that as a way to sort of examine things and ways that are not quite great often, but which then gives a huge amount of room to come along and amend that and change that and shift that and think about it differently, which is, I think, part of the fun of the Gothic. Also just decay. So, like, what was once shining and new and lustrous, like, loss. So there's also a kind of grief to a Gothic, but also a kind of clinging to a way that things once were, that feels like just kind of inherently Gothic to me. And then sort of like time and the passage of it and how that changes things, and change, I think, like, at its core, and who accepts it and who doesn't, who benefits from it, who does it, those kind of questions often come up.
Thank you so much.
Could I wait 30 seconds? I have another question. I'm
Go
very
for it.
given working off what you all just said, especially Ashley. So is haunting equivalent to queering? It sure feels like there's an overlap with, you know, with blurred boundaries. And maybe it's an obvious question, I don't know, but it's coming up to think about different ways. One of the things I'm being struck by as I listen to you talk and I've read the books is the way that contemporarily we're looking at the boundaries and thinking about whether it's queering or haunting or disability, or what the thing that's off that is actually normal if we were willing to shift our focus a little bit. I guess I've now moved out of a question, but that's a thought anyway. I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, to me, haunting ghosts feel very inherently queer, and, like, just to me open up so much possibility for thinking about that. I do think that queering does have this way of just kind of tilting, you know, like, what we think of as ordinary or normal, and just kind of broadening that, exploding that. And even on, like, a prose level, a structural level, like the way that a book is made, you know, like the idea of, you know, rising action, peak climax, that, even that, like, being able to tinker with and alter the structure of a book. You know, I talked earlier about cyclical time, or nonlinear narrative, and I think that's part of it as well. Like, so I think absolutely, like, genre and the idea of hauntings in particular feels just really rap. I mean, that's so much of the third book, is it's about ghosts. You know, my third book that I'm working on is about spiritualism, ghosts, mediumship, speaking to them, and also, like, the embodied quality of communicating with something that is beyond you. And it's a question of, like, who is afraid of that? And to whom is that really natural and normal and feels like an extension of yourself, right? So I think often that perspective is like, you know, to whom is this strange? Like, and for whom is it not? And that can be part of it, is like being in the perspective of someone who is comfortable with things that sort of disrupt and disorient.
Yeah, I also think about permeability. So the idea of a deeply permeable body is itself very queer, particularly if you're talking about men's bodies, which are mythologized as like deeply non-permeable and unable to be penetrated, but they very much are. And I think that's something that comes up for haunting as a way of permeating and getting into time and shifting it, kind of how you were talking about, and that your memories and your body and your sense of being and linearity are all able to be permeated in this way by a haunting that could be like a toxin. In the like Mel Chen sense of a queer toxin is something that proves how like radically not separate your body is from the world and time and other bodies, that you can be entered at any time in that particular way, and that you're not a special little island. And I think that comes up a lot in Summer Sons early on with ideas about possession, because that's a lot of the erotic contact like that he has with the terrifying ghost is about permeation and how it is literally inside his body, and the boundaries of his skin have really no barrier presentation to it. It can touch his insides in a very visceral sort of way. And I think that's acting as a like metaphor, but also a very literal way of thinking about queerness as a permeability and an openness to being permeated in a particular way. It's also, you know, a very horny book. And I think there's something about ghosts and queer horror that is so often about sexuality and the threat of sexuality, and in an American context, like thinking very heavily about the AIDS epidemic slash, you know, government genocide in that way, that sex can be death. And what does it mean if your friends are dying in their 20s? Like, what does that mean? Or at my age, to be missing an entire generation of mentors and brothers and etc. It's a heavy thought, but death is always kind of there, I guess, but not permanent, because we can still have memory and haunting in memory.
I'll just make one quick comment and then I'm done. All this is leading me to think about, you know, Faulkner as a queer writer. And it's just sort of, there's a new thought. I hadn't really put Faulkner in the Southern Gothic before. And so that's really provocative. I mean, it's problematic, I know, but anyway, it's provocative. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or thoughts? Oh.
Yeah, I was gonna say, any man who thinks that much about men in the way that he does, I don't know.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you. Anything else? If not, I would maybe give Lee and Ashley each a chance to see if there's anything that they would like to add to the conversation and before we wrap up.
I think we did it. Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun. And congrats on your new book.
Thank you.
Yes. Congratulations. And, you know, we look forward to you know, hearing more about your work and all of the exciting things that you're doing in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you.